Hey, hello, welcome everyone to this conversation around my book, Economics, A Global Introduction. Today, we are talking to Professor Robert MacCulloch. Hi, Robert, how are you?
Hi.
Let me introduce Professor MacCulloch. We have discussed Robert's research at various points in the book. So Robert MacCulloch holds the Mathew Abel Chair of Macroeconomics at Auckland University. Robert is from New Zealand. After graduation, he worked at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. He then traveled to the UK to complete a PhD in economics at Oxford University. Robert was awarded a Royal Economic Society Junior Fellowship and pursued research interests at the London School of Economics and Princeton University. He joined Imperial College London Business School as director of their PhD program, where he was awarded Best Teacher prizes and the Rector's Award for Distinguished Research Excellence. Robert has published numerous papers in leading scholarly journals and writes frequent columns in popular media. Hi,
Thanks,
Robert. Welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for doing this. So let's talk about some of the work you've done and some of the things I talk about in the book. So in talking about GDP, I mention your work on happiness and the relationship between GDP and happiness. And I know that you have given talks to people at places like the Reserve Bank of New Zealand about what central bankers need to know about happiness. Do you want to tell us a little bit more, share some of your views on this with the students?
Yeah, thanks, Ananish. Well, practically every textbook in economics assumes that your utility increases, that is, you get happier, the more money you have. The more money you have more opportunities, you can consume more, travel more, eat better food. So there's a view that more money is a good thing. Now, practically every textbook in the subject assumes that. And the fact is that it's not obvious that that assumption is correct. And in the last few decades, people have begun testing that assumption by trying to measure utility. So how have they done this? They've asked people questions about their well-being. The simplest question is to just ask someone, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10, from very happy to not at all happy? And then you can correlate the answers with economic variables like GDP, like your own personal income, as well, of course, as a lot of personal characteristics like, if you're married, divorced, those sorts of things. Now, it turns out that when GDP rises, it's not clear at all that over long periods of time, people's happiness actually does increase, as assumed in many of the textbooks. And one of the explanations for this phenomenon could be that people adapt to more money. As GDP rises, as your income rises, you get used to the fancy things that you've bought and the happiness wears off over time. Another view is that the effects of money are relative. It's nice to be relatively better off than your peers. That gives you a certain boost in income, but the absolute level of income you have is not so important. And this is turning into probably one of the greatest questions, and it's currently unresolved in economics of our times. Is it true that a nation like New Zealand should go for greater prosperity, higher productivity? That's what we hear every day in the media. And the assumption is that being wealthier will bring us greater happiness. Alternatively, maybe, as a lot of Kiwis maybe would like to do, focus more on their lifestyle, their overall quality of life, leisure, sport, time with their family. And maybe they're not quite as well off as a result, but maybe in the end they will be happier. And there's quite a strong link here to issues around Indigenous, the Maori economy, how Indigenous folks feel, what their values are, because many of these societies don't put such a great weight on materialism as, say, the Americans do. And the evidence so far suggests that they may have a point. So you should bear that in mind through your studies. And at the start of economics, there's this assumption that more money, more consumption brings us more happiness. Is that really true?
Okay, thank you so much. So that's actually very good, because one of the things I said in the book is that a lot of these first year books are written as if, all the questions have been answered. We know what the status is, and there is very little attempt to expose students to, the frontiers. What are the unresolved research questions? That was
Yes.
very good.
Yeah.
But so obviously, I could probably ask you a lot more on that, but we're going to move on and to my second question, which is that in the chapter where we talk about fiscal policy, I talk about the fact that governments often use budget deficits or run budget deficits to stimulate the economy during recessions. And the aim, of course, is to increase GDP, create employment. But we know that such deficits may also add to inflationary pressures, that there's often a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And again, you've done pioneering work in this area. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about this idea of there being a trade-off between inflation and unemployment?
Yes, so it was one of the old ideas that's been around 100 years, coming from one of the most famous economists that ever lived, John Maynard Keynes. This idea that if you're in a Great Depression, which occurred in the world in 1929, or more recently, the global financial crisis, the pandemic, there's a significant drop in GDP, rise in unemployment. The idea of Keynes was that this is a time maybe governments could spend more, borrow more. We also see in the newspaper our central bank was cutting interest rates. And the idea is maybe that's a way to avoid very costly, psychologically costly unemployment. Maybe that's a way to boost demand. And we've seen this play out just in the last few years in this country, the wage subsidy scheme in New Zealand, and that was nearly entirely financed by borrowing. So on the good side, you may have more unemployment, but on the bad side, it may generate more inflation because you're encouraging people to spend their money. That trade-off between unemployment and inflation was pioneered by probably the most famous New Zealand economist who ever lived, called Phillips, and it was called the Phillips curve trade-off. Now, where this work on happiness comes in is that there is still great controversy, and you see it in the newspapers still to this very day in New Zealand. Was it worthwhile for the government to borrow and spend so much? Should the Reserve Bank have cut interest rates down to almost nothing, done quantitative easing, printed $50 billion? Because we've actually been left with quite high inflation the last several years in this country. Now, whether that was worthwhile depends vitally on the costs of inflation compared to the costs of unemployment. So our government and central banks say they did a good thing because they kept unemployment quite low, and unemployment's very costly. There's another group of people who think that because inflation went up, the costs of inflation may have outweighed the costs of higher unemployment. A lot of people think that inflation has hurt us greatly as well. And there's quite a battle between these two groups of people, one who think unemployment's the most important thing to avoid, and the other who think inflation is. So you can actually try to find out what are the costs of these two of the main, most important macro variables, inflation and unemployment, through these surveys of happiness. You can correlate people's happiness with inflation and unemployment, and you can see how much does a 1% increase in inflation hurt people compared with a 1% unemployment, a 1% rise in unemployment. So that's a way these surveys can be brought to try to address this sort of question. And it's still controversial, again, like the long run effect of GDP. And you'll see that the debates are still rumbling on. And to this day, the Reserve Bank claims it was justified in creating this inflation and hurting people through bringing up interest rates to bring inflation down. But another group of people say it was a mistake as to what they did. So it all depends on the costs of those two variables.
Thank you. So I guess as an extension to that question, some of this debate always talks about austerity measures and the impact of government debt, that when you run budget deficits, that may impact economic growth, and therefore government shouldn't be running budget deficits. So do you want to tell the students a little bit more about budget deficits, debt? Does debt hurt economic growth? I mean, I don't know if you were in England when England carried out, I think, significant austerity measures in terms of reducing social services. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so in economics, of course, there are many things we've learned. I think it's unfair of the detractors who call economics the dismal science to say it's a hopeless science and economists all disagree about everything. In fact, there are a large number of things we do agree on. There are also a large number of things we still do disagree on, and a lot of things that are still unknown. So in a sense, it's quite a young science. And another question that there is still great debate upon is the costs of government debt. So you see this in New Zealand. The government borrowed a tremendous amount, as did many governments around the world, during the pandemic. And there's a debate that, was that borrowing a good thing to do? Should they have done that or should they not? And the problem, like quite a few areas in the subject one gets bogged down is there are many different views and theories about government debt, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe it is a good thing that the government borrowed during COVID because they did the wage subsidy scheme. And if you listen to the government that was in at the time, they will say they saved a lot of jobs and avoided unemployment going up. However, a lot of people now are saying the country's been stuck with quite high debt. And the detractors say that when government debt is very high, the government has effectively become a big part of the economy. It's borrowing a lot. It's competing with private businesses that also want to borrow. That pushes up interest rates. It's called crowding out. And as a result of that, the government may have done a good thing, but private industry may have suffered. There's even another view of debt you may come across, that when the government borrow more, all it really means is that in the future it's going to have to put up taxes to pay that debt off. So it's neither here nor there. It can borrow, but borrowing is really effectively the same as higher taxes. There's no difference between the two. So there are a lot of controversies about debt. And when you think about it, maybe borrowing in the short run to have a wage subsidy scheme is a good thing. But if you borrow too much, it puts up interest rates, hurts private industry, and it can be a bad thing. And because it could go either way, in theory, there's a tremendous amount of debate about whether it is a good thing to do. A helpful way to maybe look at it is even in your own personal finances. When you borrow, the way I tend to think of whether it's a good thing or not is what you're spending the money on. Some governments that are heavily indebted in the world have spent the money on themselves. Politicians have been corrupt. But other developing poor countries, when they borrow a lot, they may be using it to build infrastructure. They're getting new technologies. And if you borrow and invest the money wisely, you can get a very high rate of return, pay off the debt, and it can be a good thing that you borrowed. So it's quite similar with governments. We see great debate with our government to the extent they're borrowing. Are they borrowing on good projects or are they doing wasteful spending? So you can see it can go either way. There can be countries that are heavily indebted and it's been a terrible thing. Other countries that have borrowed quite a lot, and actually they've borrowed to use the money on wise projects. So there's tremendous debate, and I wouldn't come down on one side or the other saying government debt is good or bad without qualifying that answer.
Thank you so much. So that's all the questions I had for you.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say or talk about?
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to stop recording now.